Why the fish came out onto land. At the bottom of an old sea there lived a fish named R. He was not the largest, not the fastest, and he did not know how to make his scales shine so brightly that schools of curious fry would gather around him. He had a different gift. He noticed what the others swam past with their eyes closed. He noticed how the water grew heavier with each passing year, how the corals lost their color, how the grass near the warm currents sank onto the sand as if it had grown tired of holding on to life. He noticed that the old roots no longer led to food, that familiar caves were being filled with silt, and that the deep pits where coolness once hid now smelled of decay. The school in which our lived was proud of an ancient rule: water existed before us, water will remain after us, and whoever doubts the water is already half dead. This rule was repeated at celebrations, at funerals, before spawning, and even when the young fish asked why fewer and fewer eggs survived until spring. The elders always answered the same way: it has always been like this. You have simply become impatient. And the young fish fell silent, because in the sea, the ability to remain silent was considered a sign of maturity. But one day R rose higher than usual. He was chasing a silver insect near the very surface and, for the first time, saw the sky. Not the reflection of the sky trembling on the water, but the sky itself, vast, empty, terrifying, and free. He was so frightened that he went down to the bottom and spoke to no one for 3 days. The others decided he was ill. His mother said, "Do not look upward, my son. Everything we need is around us." His father said, "He who looks too far sees poorly what is near." And the elder of the school said, "The surface is a boundary placed there by wisdom. Boundaries exist not for cowards, but for the living." R tried to forget the sky. He swam again along the familiar paths, bowed to the older fish, gave way to the strong, gathered crumbs from the rocks, and pretended that the sea was still great. But after seeing the sky, everything began to feel cramped to him. Not because the sea had grown smaller, but because there were too many explanations in it. Every crack was called a trial, every loss a lesson, every danger a tradition, and every question an act of insolence. The fish had learned to justify misfortune so beautifully that they had stopped looking for a way out of it. That autumn, the water began to retreat from the eastern shallows. First the crabs noticed it. They moved closer to the stones and grumbled that the sea was forgetting its promises. Then the mollusks shut themselves inside their shells. Then the small fish began dying in puddles that only yesterday had been part of the great blue plain. Our school gathered near the reef, and the elders declared, "This is temporary. We must remain in the depths, preserve unity, and not give in to panic." Everyone whispered with relief. Fish liked hearing that trouble was temporary, even when it was already knocking at every home with its gills. R asked, "And what if the water retreats farther?" The elder looked at him as if he had heard not a question but betrayal. "Water does not abandon those who are faithful to it," he said. "But it has already abandoned the shallows," R replied. "The shallows were careless," said the elder. "And if it abandons us?" R did not back down. Then the elder swam closer and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "A true fish does not prepare for life without water. A true fish dies in the water with dignity." Those words lived in the school for a long time. They were repeated with pride, as though someone had found a precious pearl. The young fish admired the resolve of the elders, mothers comforted their children, and R himself felt for the first time that dignity sometimes becomes a beautiful name for fear. He did not want to die without dignity, nor with dignity. He wanted to understand whether life existed where the familiar ended. On the northern edge of the reef lived an old eel named Mur. He was blind in one eye, bore scars from birds, and had a bad reputation. They said that in his youth he had crawled out onto wet stones and seen the land. Some considered him mad, others a lure, still others a dangerous dreamer. Fish were advised not to go near him, because young fish developed questions when they were around him. And questions, as everyone knew, were more dangerous than sharks. A shark devours the body, but a question can devour an entire former life. R swam to Mur at night. They say you have seen the world above the water, he said. The old eel was silent for a long time. Then he smiled bitterly. The world above the water does not hide, he said. We are the ones hiding from it. Can one live there? Ar asked it. Not as one lives here, Mir replied. There it hurts to breathe, it hurts to move, it hurts to understand that your fins were not made for the earth. But sometimes pain is not a sign of death, but a sign of birth. Ar asked, why did you come back? Mir turned away. Because I was afraid to be the first. I saw the shore and decided that it was better to talk about it in the water than to pay for it with my own skin. That honesty struck Ar more deeply than any legend could have. He understood that the old eel was neither a saint nor a prophet, but simply someone who had once reached a door and had not entered. And for that reason his words carried more weight. Mir did not tempt him with heroism, did not promise reward, did not paint palaces of shells on the land. He only said, if you go, no one will understand you in time. First they will call you sick, then ungrateful, then dangerous. And when they themselves reach the shore, they will say they always knew the way. From that day on, Ar began to train. At night, while the school slept, he swam up to the surface and pushed his head into the air. The first breath burned him. Not even a breath, but an attempt to breathe. His gills clenched, his body convulsed, his tail struck wildly, and a white pain clouded his eyes. He fell back into the water, gulped the familiar coolness with his mouth, and swore he would never repeat that madness again. But the next night he rose again. First for a moment, then for 2, then for 3. He was not becoming a creature of the land. He was simply learning that death does not always come from where one expects it, and life does not always come in a convenient form. One day his sister Lyra noticed him. She was kind, cautious, and terribly afraid of losing her brother. Why are you torturing yourself? She asked. Ar answered, I want to be ready. Ready for what? For the possibility that the sea is not obliged to remain the same just because we are used to it. Lyra began to cry, if one can say such a thing about a fish, because the tears of fish immediately become part of the sea. You speak as if you do not love us, she said. Ar could not find an answer for a long time. Then he said, I love you too much to pretend nothing is happening. Lyra told no one, but she began avoiding her brother. It frightened her to be near someone who called things by their true names. Adult life is often arranged exactly that way. We are offended not by lies, but by truth, because a lie asks only for agreement, while truth demands change. Winter came without cold. The warm currents turned muddy, and one morning the entire southern valley of the sea became as shallow as a child's memory. Fish thrashed between puddles, crabs fought for damp crevices, and birds walked across the former seemed like tax collectors through a poor village. Ar's school retreated to the last deep hollow. Now it was crowded there. Those who had spoken yesterday of dignity today pushed the weak toward the edge. Those who had called for unity were the first to take places in the cool shade. Those who had condemned panic hid food for their own children. Ar looked at all of this and understood trouble does not create character, it only removes its decorations. The wise do not become wise because of danger, they simply reveal the wisdom they carried before it. The greedy do not become greedy because of hunger, hunger merely gives them an excuse. On the third night, the hollow began to dry. The water receded not quickly but relentlessly. For the first time, the fish heard the sound of their own helplessness, the wet slapping of bodies, heavy breathing, short cries of fray. The elders gathered again and declared, we must wait for the tide. When will it come? Someone asked. The tide comes to those who know how to wait, the elders answered. But their voices no longer carried the same strength. They themselves were looking at the sky and hating it for its silence. Ar swam to the edge of the hollow. Beyond the strip of mud lay wet stones, and beyond them, the dark unknown land. He remembered Mir's words, the pain of his first breaths, Lyra's tears, the mockery of his neighbors, and the calm cruelty of the phrase, a true fish dies in the water. Then he turned to the school and said, I will try to go out. There may be no salvation there. But there is none here anymore. Someone laughed. Someone called him mad. The elder shouted, You are betraying the sea. R answered, No, I am betraying only the fear you call the sea. And he leapt out. The first touch of land was terrible. Sand stuck to his sides, pebbles wounded his belly, and his body became heavy like someone else's guilt. In the water he had been movement, on land he became weight. Every jerk cost him as if all the habits of the world were dragging him backward. His gills burned. The air was rough, empty, not made for him. He struck with his tail, crawled, slipped, crawled again. The school watched. Some with disgust, some with secret hope, some with the kind of anger that another's courage awakens in those who have long ago made peace with their own cowardice. Lyra rushed after him to the very edge of the water, but stopped. Come back, she cried. I cannot watch you suffer. R turned his head with difficulty. Then do not look at the suffering, he said. Look at the direction. I do not know whether I will survive. But if I disappear beyond the stones, it means the path exists at least as far as the stones. He crawled until dawn. Many times it seemed to him that he was dying. Then he understood that it was not he who was dying, but his old idea of himself. The fish who believed the world ended with water truly was dying. But beneath that fear something else was awakening, not a bird, not a beast, not a miracle, but a stubborn living creature that did not ask the past for permission to enter the future. In the morning he reached a flat stone where rainwater had collected in small hollows. He lay in a shallow little pool between sky and earth, and for the first time saw the sun not as a stain above the surface, but as a fire before which one could not hide behind the murky depths. The sun did not comfort and did not pity. It simply illuminated, and in that there was a strange mercy. On land one cannot deceive oneself for long, because here everything is seen more sharply: wounds, the path, loneliness, the price. During the day a bird arrived. The shadow of its wing covered R, and he understood that the new world was not obliged to be kind merely because it was difficult. He lunged into a crack between the stones and escaped the beak by a miracle. His heart beat so hard it seemed the whole shore would hear it. So this is all your freedom, said an inner voice. Before sharks could eat you, now birds can. Before you feared the depths, now you fear the sky. What has changed? R lay in the darkness and answered himself, what has changed is that I no longer confuse safety with life. By evening it began to rain. Drops struck the stones, gathered into little streams, and flowed toward the sea. R understood for the first time that water existed not only in the sea. It fell from the sky, hid in leaves, shone on moss, flowed beneath the earth, returned, disappeared, and returned again. The sea was not the only form of water. In the same way, he thought home is not always the place where you were born. Sometimes home is the ability not to die when the old place stops being home. For several days R lived between puddles. He learned to wait for rain, to hide from birds, to move in short bursts, to listen to the earth with his belly. He did not become happy in the simple sense. Freedom rarely arrives with a soft bed. But he became real. Every movement now belonged to him. In the sea, the school had thought for him, tradition had thought for him, fear had thought for him, habit had thought for him, someone else's voice had thought for him. On land, he had to think for himself, and that was heavier than hunger. On the fifth day, he found a narrow stream running inland from the shore. Its water was shallow but alive. R entered it, and his body trembled with relief. The stream was not the sea. In it he could not accelerate freely, could not hide in the depths, could not dissolve among thousands of similar bodies. But it led somewhere. And that somewhere turned out to be more important than the old as always. Meanwhile, the hollow where the school remained kept shrinking. The elders no longer spoke of dignity. They spoke of order. Then of punishment for doubt. Then of how the young were to blame because they did not believe strongly enough in the tide. then of how Ar had brought disaster upon them with his disobedience. When reality becomes unbearable, many prefer to search for someone guilty rather than search for a way out. A guilty one is more convenient than a way out. He can be cursed without changing oneself. Lyra listened to this and remained silent. But every night she swam to the edge of the hollow and looked at the trail her brother had left in the mud. The trail gradually dried, crumbled, and was erased by the wind. And it seemed to her that with it the last possibility was being erased. She remembered his words, "If I disappear beyond the stones, it means the path exists at least as far as the stones." There was no promise of salvation in those words. But sometimes a person, a fish, or an entire people does not need a promise, only proof that a boundary is not a wall. When the water became very shallow, Lyra made her decision. She called several young fish and said, "I do not know whether Ar is alive. But I know that he did not die here." The young fish were frightened. One said, "The elders have forbidden us to go out." Lyra answered, "A prohibition has power only where there is a future. On a dry bottom, a prohibition is no longer a law but a decoration." Another said, "We are not made for land." Lyra said, "We are no longer made for this water either, because there is almost none left." They crawled out at night. Not all of them. Most stayed. Some did not believe, some could not, some hoped until the very end that the familiar world was obligated to justify their loyalty. The elder stayed too. Before dawn he was still repeating, "The tide is near." Perhaps he truly believed it. Or perhaps over the long years he had merged so completely with his own voice that he could no longer tell belief from a roll. There are people who perish not because they cannot see the truth, but because once they called it a lie too loudly and can no longer retreat without losing face. Lyra's path was more terrible than ours because she knew how painful it would be. The first walks into the unknown blindly, the second walks with imagination. She crawled, fell, gasped for breath, and heard someone behind her give up and beg to be returned to the water. But behind them there was almost no water left. Then she understood the cruelest truth of change. What calls us backward is often not home, but the memory of home. The real home may already have disappeared, while memory still smells of safety for a long time. By noon Lyra reached the rocky ridge and saw the stream. Beside it lay Ar. He was thin, scratched, with dulled scales and a new, unfamiliar gaze. It was the gaze of one who had not defeated the world but had stopped asking it for mercy. Lyra wanted to say many words, "Forgive me, I was afraid, I did not understand, I missed you." But she said only, "You are alive." Ar answered, "For now, yes. Now we must keep learning." 7 others came after Lyra. From the great school only 7. Later legends would increase that number. Descendants would say, "Our ancestors bravely came out onto land." They would not say that most of their ancestors stayed behind, arguing with the drying water. History often decorates the courage of the dead and washes away the indecision of the living so that descendants can more easily be proud of themselves. But the truth was this: those who were saved were not the best, not the strongest, and not the most worthy. Those who were saved were the ones who managed to admit in time that the old way of living no longer worked. A new life began by the stream. It was poor, uneven, and full of mistakes. The fish learned to move over wet earth, to seek shade, to survive the heat, to tell a rain cloud from an empty one. They argued, quarreled, and sometimes regretted not having died with everyone else in familiar water. Because a new life does not immediately become a blessing. At first it looks like punishment for courage. You lose your familiar skills and have not yet acquired new ones. You are no longer respected for old achievements because the new world does not know your former medals. Everything you were proud of may turn out to be useless on the other shore. One young fish asked Ar, "So the sea was evil?" Ar looked for a long time at the distant blue line beyond the stones. "No," he said. "The sea was our beginning. The mistake was not in the sea. The mistake was that we decided a beginning had the right to be an ending." Another asked, "So the elders were enemies?" are answered, some were cowards, some were blind, some were simply tired. But the main enemy was not in them. The main enemy lived in everyone who preferred a beautiful habit to a bitter truth. Months passed. The fence of those who survived grew stronger. They did not turn into legs overnight, as storytellers like to say. Change rarely respects the impatient. The body changed slowly, through pain, through failures, through the deaths of those who could not endure the middle of the path. But the children born by the stream no longer feared the air the way their parents had feared it. They played on wet stones and laughed at what adults called impossible. For children, the impossible is often simply the place where their parents once became afraid. Sometimes are returned to the edge of the former hollow. Tough grass now grew there. The wind drove white shells across the sand. Almost nothing remained of the old school except the smell of salt after rain. R felt no triumph. He understood that victory over another's wrongness does not warm the soul as one imagines in moments of resentment. When those who laughed at you perish, no celebration appears inside. A heavy silence appears. You wanted them to understand, not disappear. One day he found the elder. He lay near a dried stone, almost whole, preserved by salt and sun. His eyes were open to the sky, which he had spent his life forbidding others to fear and see. R stopped beside him. Old anger rose within him, but quickly passed. Before him lay not a ruler, not a judge, not a keeper of rules, but a small dried body that had once been terribly afraid of losing the meaning of its life. R said quietly, "You were wrong. But you too wanted to save us in the only way you knew." And for the first time he forgave him, not because the elder deserved forgiveness, but because hatred is too heavy for those who are already crawling across land. Over the years our story became a parable. It was told to the young before their first journey from the stream to the distant stones. But wise storytellers never began with the heroic deed. They said the fish came out onto land not because it despised the water. It came out because life turned out to be greater than water. This mattered, because every new stream eventually begins to think of itself as the sea. Every saved generation sooner or later builds its own prohibitions, its own convenient explanations, its own beautiful words for fear. And then someone is born again who looks beyond the edge of the familiar and asks a question unpleasant to everyone. One of our descendants, small and stubborn, once asked, "And what if the stream dries up too?" The adults exchanged glances. Irritation flashed in their eyes. After all, they had suffered so much to reach the stream, and this fry was already doubting. One old survivor almost said, "The stream existed before you and will remain after you." But R, now very old, stopped him. He swam up to the young one and said, "Then we will search farther. Not because we do not value the stream, but because we value life." That evening, the young gathered around R by the water that murmured between the stones. He said to them, "Remember, the world does not ask whether it is convenient for you to change. Time does not knock 3 times, does not wait for you to finish arguing, does not respect your titles, grievances, or achievements. It simply leads the water away. And each one decides for himself to call the retreating sea a test of loyalty, or to admit that it is time to learn to breathe differently." He said, "Not everyone who calls you onto land is wise. There are madmen who love destruction for the sake of noise. There are proud ones who flee from home not toward freedom, but away from responsibility. There are merchants of novelty who sell fear under the name of the future. So do not worship every new shore. But do not curse it merely because your fins tremble. Look at the facts. Look at the water. Look at those who quietly hide food while teaching you patience. Look at those who forbid questions because they have no answers." He said, "The most dangerous captivity is not a stone cage. The most dangerous captivity is a life in which pain has become familiar and familiarity has become sacred. There a slave thanks the chain because it rings in a familiar way. There a poor man fears the wealth of choice more than poverty. There an adult defends the swamp only because he once learned how to swim in it. The young were silent. They did not understand everything, but they felt they were listening not to a story about the past, but to a warning about themselves. Then Ar told them about the first breath, about shame, about mockery, about the sister who was afraid. About the old eel who had seen the shore and returned, about the elder who preferred to die right in his own words rather than live in someone else's reality. And he added, "Do not judge those who stay too easily. In each of you there is one who wants to stay. In each of you there is a voice that will say, 'It is still too early, it has not yet been proven, we may still endure, somehow it will pass.' That voice is not always an enemy. Sometimes it protects you from foolishness, but if it makes you close your eyes to the drying water, then it already serves death." That night Ar remained alone. Above him were the stars. Once he had seen them only as trembling sparks on the surface of the sea. Now they hung high and cold, like holes in a vast darkness. He thought that all life consists of surfaces we mistake for ceilings. For a Frey, the ceiling is the upper layer of water. For an adult fish, it is the law of the school. For an elder, it is his own rightness. For a survivor, it is his achievement. But beyond every ceiling there may be another sky, and happiness is not in coming out onto land once and then calming down. Happiness is in not turning your land into a new bottom. Before his death, Ar asked Lyra to take him to the place where the stream first touched the stones. She too was already old, but she fulfilled his request. They were silent for a long time. Then Lyra said, "I often wondered, why were you the first to come out?" Ar smiled, as much as a creature with a fish's mouth can smile. "I was not braver than everyone else," he said. "It is just that one day I became afraid not of the land, but of living my whole life in a world that ended at the border of my fear." Lyra asked, "Do you regret it?" Ar answered, "I regret only that for too long I wanted permission from those who were prisoners themselves. When he died they did not make him an idol. Lyra forbade it. She said, 'If we turn him into a sacred figure, then one day we will forbid questions in his name.' And he came out onto land precisely because he was tired of sacred things used to cover fear. So instead of a monument, they left a simple scratch on a stone. Life is greater than habit." Many generations passed. The descendants of those fish could now lie for a long time on damp earth, crawl into the shade of roots, wait out drought, and return to water without their former dependence. They told their children the story of the fish who came out onto land, but every good storyteller ended with a question, "And where is your water?" At first the children laughed, because the water was right in front of them. Then the storyteller explained, "Water is not only the sea. Water is everything without which you cannot imagine yourself. A job where you are humiliated but paid in a familiar way. A home where there has long been no love, but there is a familiar table. A belief that has died, but is still decorated with words. A position you cling to though it is holding you by the throat. An image of yourself that once saved you and now prevents you from growing. Every person carries his own sea within. And one day it may begin to retreat." Adults listened to this parable, and each heard something of his own. One remembered a business that should have been closed long ago. Another remembered a person who should long ago have been forgiven or let go. A third remembered a truth he had postponed for years. A fourth understood that he himself had become an elder to his children, forbidding them not danger but the future. A fifth grew angry and said the parable was too cruel. But he was not angry at the fish. He was angry at the shore, which he had already seen for a long time out of the corner of his eye. And the meaning of the parable was simple, although simple meanings are the hardest to accept. The fish came out onto land not out of curiosity, not out of pride, and not for glory. It came out because one day it understood, if the environment that raised you begins to kill you, loyalty to it ceases to be a virtue. Adulthood begins where a person stops demanding eternal guarantees from the past and begins to take responsibility for his own movement. Sometimes life is saved not by the strongest, but by the one who first agrees to look ridiculous. The one who crawls while others speak beautifully about dignity. the one who is ready to lose his old name in order to gain breath. And when someone asked, "Why did the fish come out onto land?" the old ones answered, "Because the water left before it did." And then they added more quietly, "And because it understood this while it could still move."